Hello everyone, let's review the results of February's 3-card blind main event tournament. This is the first month where we saw Aether Drift legal in the format, and we were coming off of some pretty substantial unbans, so this was an exciting month. There were 220 players that participated in the tournament, including long-standing players, returning players, and 32 brand new players to the event. I want to thank all players who participated this month, especially new players, who have helped keep this community and format as vibrant as it is. There were 152 unique decks among the 220 that were submitted. Because the prior month was the second most diverse month we've ever seen, comparatively the meta this month felt much less diverse. But if we weigh every card submitted this month by their average score and run them through the Simpsons Diversity Index, you will see that this month was a diverse and healthy meta, even if it was a little bit of a downgrade from the month prior. The 3-card blind diversity grade for this month was a B. Coming into this month, we expected some significant meta shakeups because Bitter Blossom and Maze of Ith were both unbanned, and the new set Aether Drift brought in a powerful new 1-drop, Basri, Tomorrow's Champion. Even just looking at the other 2 cards mentioned, it's easy to understand why Maze of Ith didn't have a strong return to the format despite being banned for how powerful it was in the past. It turns out that when you're facing down a meta filled with very powerful token generators, being a card that stops a single large creature just isn't as appealing. On the other hand, our other unbanned, Bitter Blossom, was the most popular card this month with a 14.09% popularity. Despite being so popular, Bitter Blossom had a somewhat tame average score, and there's a couple reasons that might be the case. The first of which is that players playing Bitter Blossom submitted decks that range from established to experimental, and Bitter Blossom had mixed results as a consequence of this. Another factor to consider here is that because Bitter Blossom is an extremely powerful and recently unbanned card, members of the community were on high alert and expected to be playing against this deck and came prepared. Of particular note, Basri fits really well into an existing 3-card blind shell, which is with Caracas and Leyline of Singularity. Although Leyline of Singularity is a symmetrical effect, and therefore turns off Basri's ability to create more than one cat, the fact that Leyline of Singularity prevents players from being able to have more than one copy of the same token makes Leyline of Singularity a very powerful solution to Bitter Blossom, while also providing protection against decks that run a single large creature, because Caracas in combination with Leyline of Singularity can be used as a repeatable bounce effect. And I think it's worth mentioning here that playing Leyline of Singularity as a pre-game effect is optional, so in the event that Basri would benefit from being able to produce more than one cat, they can simply choose to play the game without relying on that Leyline of Singularity effect. There are of course other interesting facets of this meta, but I think we can cover some of those as we begin to congratulate our winners for this month. In Novice 2, our winner was M. Poof, who is playing Assassin's Trophy, Golgari Rot Farm, and Treetop Village. We've seen this deck and variations of it have quite a bit of success in the past few months. Having the ability to blow up any type of permanent, and a threat that is a little trickier to interact with, makes this deck a resilient and versatile one across many different types of metas. In Novice 1, our winner was Emil Machine, who was playing Ancient Tomb, Time Vault, and Voltaic Servant. If the opponent isn't able to put up a blocker or interact with your game plan by your second turn of the game, you're able to take an unlimited number of turns by using Voltaic Servant to untap Time Vault, and by extension of this, you can continue attacking with Voltaic Servant until you've won the game. I think it is worth briefly touching on the rules for loops in 3-card blind and Magic the Gathering in general here, which don't allow you to force a tie by taking an opponent hostage and holding them in an infinite turn loop for the rest of time. So in the games where you can't win but you can take an unlimited number of turns, that unlimited number still has to be a finite number. You have to eventually let your opponent take a turn. In Aspirant 3, our winner was Wind701, who was playing Basri, Tomorrow's Champion, Caracas, and Leyline of Singularity. We already touched on this combination earlier in the video, but I think it is worth mentioning here that this was a very real deck and it wasn't all just hype. Wind701's average score of 88% is as strong of an indicator as any that this deck was no joke. In Aspirant 2, our winner was E-Train, who was playing Bitter Blossom, Peat Bog, and Smallpox, which was one of the two most popular variations of Bitter Blossom decks this month. Bitter Blossom is a threat that lets you break parity on Smallpox, and Smallpox is devastating to many different strategies in the format. In Aspirant 1, our winner was Serval Error, who was playing Ancient Tomb, Mana Vault, and Thought-Knot Seer. We will be returning to this deck later in the video, but for now, it's sufficient to say that a deck that pretty much wins any game where it takes the first turn and gets to play a 4/4 in the other games is pretty darn effective. In Contender 5, our winner was Dawn Cthulhu, who was playing Baron Glory, Lotus Bloom, and Show and Tell. Baron Glory has been an increasingly popular deck in the past few months, but this version takes a slightly different spin on it by running Show and Tell instead of a second copy of Lotus Bloom. Running Show and Tell is a bit of a risk because it could allow your opponent to pull into play a card like Angel of Sanctions, which will allow them to disrupt your entire game plan by getting rid of your Baron Glory. However, I think there's a decent argument that if you were going to run Show and Tell, this was the month to do it, and the reason for that is that Leyline of Singularity was suspected to be a pretty popular card because it counters Bitter Blossom and works very well with Basri. Leyline of Singularity also deceptively beats most Baron Glory decks because they will have to put both of their Lotus Blooms into play during their upkeep, which means they're going to have to either crack the Lotus Blooms during their upkeep or lose one of them to the legendary rule. Either way, because mana pools empty at the end of phases, by the time you get to your main phase and are able to cast Baron Glory, the mana's already gone. And although Dawn Cthulhu would have won this pod either way, by running Show and Tell instead of 2 Lotus Blooms, they managed to have a slightly higher average score. In Contender 4, our winner was Agent Axolotl, who was playing Mox Ruby, Mutavault, and Sphere of Resistance. We've seen a few decks like this one perform very well in the past, but this is the first time we've seen this particular combination claim a win. The overwhelming majority of decks cannot play through Sphere of Resistance, which means that while taking the first turn of the game, Agent Axolotl wins more often than not. And against some decks that are a little bit slower, it still wins even when going second. Notably against all of the Bitter Blossom decks that were running Peat Bog, as well as some of the Baron Glory decks that can't pay for their Lotus Blooms when they come off of Suspend. In Contender 3, we had a tie between Alvi and LOL44, who were both playing Bitter Blossom, Mox Jet, and Mutavault. This was the other most popular Bitter Blossom deck this month, and overall this version had a higher average score despite there being some variation from pod to pod. This version completely forgoes interactivity and just goes for a win as fast as possible. Against interactive decks, Bitter Blossom itself is relatively hard to remove, and against more aggressive opponents, Bitter Blossom is also very good at slowing down the game because it generates a blocker every turn. In Contender 2, we had a 5-way tie, with the first 2 players, Books and Chico, playing Isochron Scepter, Lightning Helix, and Mana Crypt. For those of you who are newer to the format, the choice to use Mana Crypt over Ancient Tomb might seem a bit strange to you. However, cards that mess with lands are pretty common in 3-card blind, so by using Mana Crypt instead of Ancient Tomb, Books and Chico were both able to get wins against Magus of the Moon and Smallpox decks that they would have otherwise lost if they had been relying on a land as their mana source. Our other 3 winners in Contender 2, Firewinner, Jimothy, and TIS were all playing Baron Glory, Lotus Bloom, and Lotus Bloom. We've already touched on Baron Glory quite a bit, and there really isn't much else to say. Against decks that have no way to disrupt your game plan, and can't keep up with the clock that's set by those Lotus Blooms, you just outright win the game. In Contender 1, our winner was the Number Pie, who was playing Ancient Tomb, Lodestone Golem, and Mana Vault. We're able to see a little bit of a trend at this point where we have cards like Thought-Knot Seer and Sphere of Resistance, and Lodestone Golem as well, that are incredibly effective while taking the first turn, and also pick up free wins against decks that are a little slower to deploy their strategies. And that gives us a clear segue into our winner for our Exemplar pod, which was Talons and Tails, who was playing Crystal Vein, Manifold, and Thought-Knot Seer. For those of you who have been following the format for a long time, you probably anticipated that we'd eventually see Thought-Knot Seer become a dominant deck in the meta. Hand attack decks that go first and win the game are nothing new in the 3-card blind format, and compared to some other options, Thought-Knot Seer's 4/4 body is a legitimate threat and can hold its own against some decks even when it's not taking the first turn of the game. This has ultimately led to Talons and Tails claiming the champion title with a whopping 1917 ELO rating. And with that, I'd like to congratulate our winners one more time, and then move on to discussing the cards that will be included in this month's community ban vote. Let's start things off by discussing Bitter Blossom. Bitter Blossom was the most popular card this month, and despite its seemingly mediocre average score, we did see it win multiple pods using different shells. Its natural resistance to removal, difficult to block go-wide game plan, and ability to fend off dangerous non-trampling creatures all make this an incredibly effective card. If I were to make a prediction, I suspect if we don't see Bitter Blossom added back to the ban list this month, we would see the meta start to correct for Bitter Blossom, which would mean that it would probably go down in popularity, but up in performance. I think it's up to personal preference whether folks would like Bitter Blossom to remain a critical part of the meta, or if the card feels too powerful to be enjoyable for the format. Next up we have Barren Glory, which we talked about multiple times throughout this video because it claimed some pod wins and had a significant impact on the meta as one of the more popular strategies. As a matter of fact, Barren Glory Double Lotus Bloom was the most popular deck this month. Now, if Barren Glory does get banned, we can suspect that many things will take its place. Double Lotus Bloom or Lotus Bloom and Show and Tell have many different options that we haven't seen thrive as much because Barren Glory has simply been the more consistent alternative. So from one perspective, we'll still continue to see Lotus Bloom plus some giant finisher no matter how this vote goes, but from the other perspective, if Barren Glory does get added to the ban list, we might be able to see a more diverse set of powerful threats that Lotus Bloom enables. Next we have Basri Tomorrow's Champion, which was tied as the 5th most popular card this month. Although we predominantly discussed Basri in the context of Caracas and Late Line of Singularity, the card is incredibly flexible and can be run with a variety of different combinations. It was a key part of the meta this month, and moving forwards, it will become a defining part of the format if it remains legal. Next up we have Thought-Knot Seer, which won multiple pods and claimed the overall win in Exemplar. Including this card on the vote is part of the process of slaying the many-headed hydra of turn 1 hand attack wins within the 3-card blind format. I do think that hand attack has its place in the format, but the baseline score that you tend to get for messing with your opponent's hand on the first turn of the game tends to have a bare minimum score of around 50%. Because of how effective the baseline of these strategies are, I don't think it's appropriate for these strategies to also be winning overall, except on rare occasions. And our final card on the list will be a bit of a surprise to some of you that haven't been following the format as closely, but that card is going to be Sarcomancy. Although it hasn't been mentioned in this video yet, the increasingly popular Sarcomancy plus Tel Jalad Stylus deck has performed very well in the past few months, including this one. Although you begin the game with no cards in your library in 3-card blind, if cards do end up in your library, you would draw them as normal. This means the combination of Tel Jalad Stylus and Sarcomancy will allow a player to produce a 2/2 zombie token every turn by tucking Sarcomancy back into your library. This deck is also deceptively resilient because Tel Jalad Stylus can be used as a way to protect itself and Sarcomancy if the opponent has a removal for either of them. So if my opponent were to cast something like Divine Gambit targeting either of these permanents, I can put it into my deck to prevent it from being exiled. This is a powerful strategy, and its presence in the meta is certainly noteworthy. And that wraps up the cards that will be included in this month's community ban vote. Don't forget to visit the website linked in the description of this video if you want to participate in the vote. Thank you again to everybody who participated in the tournament this month. It's always fun to see how your creativity and efforts cause this format to evolve. Thanks for watching everyone, and see you soon.